Monday afternoon, so happy to have you here. It's going to be a great conversation. I like to think they're all great conversations, but I'm definitely positively sure this one is going to be, because Gabrielle and I have been working on it for several months. So I know it's going to be terrific. I want to make sure that you know that this is live streamed on Facebook right now. It will stay on Facebook for about a week or so until it is edited, and then it will go up on the website permanently, along with all the other panels that we've done since the fall of 2016. We take these panels very seriously as an educational resource, and therefore we approach them with that same level of intellectual rigor and purpose. So I think you will find all of them interesting across a wide variety of disciplines and topics. The other thing I would ask you to do is please check your cell phones. I know you think you turned it off. Did you? Did you? Yeah, so it's always good to have just another check if you possibly could do that. And my name is Linda Lees. I am the Director of Cultural Programming and Special Projects for TEFAF New York. Sometimes it's good to know who's talking to you. I'm going to introduce the moderator, and he will then introduce the panel, and we'll get going. So Gabriel Perez Barreiro is not what I have in the brochure. He is now the senior advisor to the Patricia Phelps Cisneros collection. So I'm not going to try it in Spanish because I don't want to insult anybody. So take it away, Gabriel.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, my panelists, for being here. Very excited, such an incredible group of people. Thanks also for this audience. Didn't expect to see this many people on a Monday afternoon, but that's terrific. So I'm just going to make a few introductory comments, then we're going to move on to the discussion, and then hopefully we'll have time for all the many questions and opinions and arguments that I'm sure will come from the audience. So when we started talking about a panel of art from Latin America, sort of my heart sunk a little bit. There's been perhaps too many panels on art from Latin America, and they tend to be a little bit circular. So one of the questions was how, what's happening that we could talk about that might be new? Who might be some different colleagues to have here in front talking about perhaps a slightly different angle. So we decided, and given that this is an art fair, to sort of focus on the market, but not just because it's an art fair, because I think there really has been a sea change in this field that certainly I've seen over my professional life. From when I was a student, early student of art from Latin America, the market was the easy enemy. The market was dull, it was somewhat stereotypical, and it was sort of everything we as younger scholars and curators were fighting against. So the sort of mother lode of the market as we saw it, perhaps in a stereotypical way, were the auction houses here in New York, and they would hold regular sales of which there was a kind of predictable parade of artists that responded to a fairly traditional stereotype of what Latin American art should look like, so social realism, magical realism, and this kind of constituted a certain kind of canon. And it was a canon we were all kind of set out to destroy and overcome and fight the good fight against. That situation has changed 180 degrees. And from the market being this thing that was at best irrelevant, at worst an explicit sort of dead weight on the field, today I think we could argue that it's one of the most dynamic and interesting areas within the field. And so that relationship has changed radically. Even professionally, I was remembering, working at the Americas Society 20 years ago, we would not program an artist who had a commercial gallery because the idea was kind of that our job was to kind of go beyond that. Today, that's a position that I don't think would even be sustainable anymore. So there's definitely been a radical shift. There's a shift in how curators discover artists. Now somebody can discover an artist at an art fair in Miami or in Buenos Aires or in Lima. That's something that whole regional art fair scene didn't exist until about 10 years ago, and now is a very important part of the ecosystem for the entire field. So there have been a lot of changes in how the curatorial and intellectual and academic world relate to the gallery field. And I think we haven't heard enough about that, or haven't really been able to sort of dig deep into that. What is the impact of that on collecting, what's the impact of that on institutions, on programming, on the new generation of people coming in. So I think that there's a very rich new situation to discuss in which we have to cast away a lot of the old sort of stereotypes of how we thought about the market, perhaps 20 years ago. Also, speaking of the sea change, I think the timing of this panel is great. We're just 2 weeks after the reopening of MoMA, which I think for many of us sort of represented, if not a novelty, certainly a sort of institutional cementing of things we have all been talking about for a long time, about how the canon is becoming ever more global, how Latin American art has been incorporated into that canon. It's now almost it's unthinkable to tell the story of modernism without including Latin America. There is, of course, the exhibition Sul Moderno. Obviously, full disclosure, I was involved in that process from the Cisneros collection. So again, a private collection interacting with a public institution to create that sort of change of sensibility. That's a whole other story. We're not going to go into that today. But not just in that exhibition. As you leave that exhibition and you go through the other floors of the museum, you'll see dialogues between Tarsila Amaral and Brancusi, between Jasper Johns and Marisol. Suddenly the museum has really kind of opened up that way. Again, this is something many of us have been advocating for a long time. What's incredible to see how natural it feels, and the fact that this is now sort of built into the DNA of the institution. So we're not dealing with the kind of cyclical things that we used to have through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where Latin America would kind of come and then disappear. Now it's just a very naturalized part of any institutional, academic, or market program. So what is the role of the galleries in there? One of the things that I think is interesting is not just the increasing importance of the galleries in facilitating that circulation of works. All of that has to happen. If the works have to enter the collections, they have to be seen, they have to be at the fairs, they have to be promoted, the young artists have to get into the system somehow, the secondary market has to circulate those works. So a very robust and dynamic system has emerged. And one of its characteristics, I think, is that it's gone from being perhaps a homogeneous system to a very diversified system. So in putting together the panel today, I was very interested in bringing together differences and not similarities, of how many. It's almost as if each gallery has found a very specific angle. So there are many, many more than are represented here, but I thought this was a good kind of cross-section of different approaches of how to incorporate, deal with, process, respond to this ever-increasing interest in art from Latin America. So let me introduce the panelists, and we can now go to the main part of the program. So immediately to my left is Cecilia Brunson of Cecilia Brunson Projects in London. This is a gallery that explicitly states that it focuses on Latin America, but outside Latin America. It's based in London. Now, Cecilia started her professional life as a curator, studied at Bard Center for Curatorial Studies, as did many curators of her generation. Then worked at the Americas Society, at the Blanton Museum of Art. For full disclosure, we were colleagues in both of those institutions, so working within two pioneering institutions in the presentation of art from Latin America. Before setting up on her own, first in her native Chile, and then several years ago in London, and has been kind of consistently building a program that defines itself in terms of its specialization. To the left of her is Pedro Mendes, who is a founder of Mendes Wood DM, which is, as many of you know, one of the most dynamic contemporary art galleries in Latin America, I would perhaps say in the world, with locations in Sao Paulo, Brussels, and here in New York. The best description I found is one they themselves did, which was a millennial gallery with a 60s vibe. I thought that was such a good description of the work they do. But it's one of the first galleries. There's a new phenomenon now, which is galleries from Latin America with an international footprint. So here in New York City, as well as Mendes Wood, we have Nara Rosla Gallery, we have Curimansuto. This is a new phenomenon of the last few years, and I'm very excited to sort of hear about how that has suddenly become a possibility where it wasn't before. Another thing to say about, in the many artists that Mendes Wood has championed, they've made a special focus, or perhaps whether it's accidental or intentional, but to bring to light many artists of Afro-Brazilian heritage in an art system which is still very predominantly white. To his left, Donald Johnson Montenegro is Senior Director of Loring Augustine Gallery here in New York, where he spearheaded a series of initiatives with Latin American artists in a gallery that does not define itself as such. So a gallery with an international stable of artists, which includes naturally integrated a number of artists from Latin America. So he's worked very closely with artists and estates like Ligia Clark, Tunga. He's currently organizing the first New York presentation of the work of Luciano Gueira, Brazilian sculptor who was based in London. In 2015, he organized a wonderful exhibition that many of you may have seen called Casa Vazia, which looked at several generations of Brazilian sculptors from concretism to the present day. He's also co-founder of ANCLA, which is a new organization for Latin American art professionals in New York. To his left is someone who, in case you hadn't noticed, is the non-gallerist on the panel. Very important to say that. And Patrick requires very little introduction. He's director of El Museo del Barrio since 2017, an institution born of the civil rights era to represent the culture of Puerto Rican community in New York. But that's evolved, not without controversy, since then to incorporate art from elsewhere in Latin America. Patrick is also a notable collector of contemporary art, which is a very unusual profile for a museum director, and I think that's something we can talk about, and hopefully we'll have some insights on that relationship and on that double role. He was also director of the Museo Colección Jumex in Mexico City, which is a private collection, again, that has been, I think, together with the Costantini, with the Malva in Buenos Aires, the Cisneros collection without a museum, and Jumex, as some of the private initiatives that have really gone very far to shape the field, both in terms of the market and in terms of the institution. So I think he has a very unique and informed perspective on the various issues that we'll be talking around. So now I will start to talk a little less. And what I'd like to do is ask a series of questions to each of the panelists, and hopefully we can then get the discussion going. So the first question I'd like to ask all of you, and maybe we can keep this order, is how important or useful this term Latin America is in terms of the work you do. Cecilia.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. I get a lot of questions, are you a gallery or are you a sort of non-for-profit? And I am a commercial gallery, even though I don't really participate in art fairs, so it's a real pleasure to be part of an art fair operatus. It's really interesting, this term, the Latin American art term. I think if I would have opened up my gallery 6-7 years ago in New York, I would have never used the term Latin America. But because I was in London and there was a very strong tradition and relationship to Latin America, I thought the path had already, in a way, been built. Most of you know Guy Brett in the 60s had signals, and that whole operation was very much marginal in London and very much at the periphery of what was going on in London at the time. You know, Lucien Freud and, you know, the whole painter abstraction. But then there's another very important aspect about England, which is it has the University of Essex, which is the only university exclusively dedicated to Latin American art. So that also has created a field where not only did Gabriel come out of that, but Cuauhtémoc Medina and a whole generation of sort of thinking, important intellectuals and curators that really defined and created this sort of Latin American field. And then in 1989, the first exhibition ever of Latin American art, curated and thought and research by Don Addis, happened at the Hayward Gallery. So with this history and with this tradition, it was kind of like impossible not to open up a gallery dedicated to Latin American art, which was the last thing I wanted to do. And kind of then that was tied to the fact that I live in a very quirky property in London, and then attached to it was an old printing press. So the gallery is also attached to my home. So I'm not really like a capitalist commercial space. Through my gallery, sometimes my children run around, there's all sorts of things happening, and I wanted to keep it that way because I didn't want to lose that authentic thing about Latin American art today in this capitalist market. So the term Latin America has become crucial to survive in London.
Great, thank you. Pedro?
As you know, Brazilians never consider themselves Latin American,
of course.
First of all. And this has been really quite of a personality disorder that we've had along the years. Nevertheless, we've been put into many of the, in the scope of auctions and museum collections and several realms of the market as Latin America. And that has been interesting in many ways and has been detrimental to the understanding of the totality of Latin America art in other ways. What crucially happens in the last, I would say, 20 years in Brazil is with the boom that happens in 2005, there is a vast amount of young collectors entering the market, and there's a vast amount of new artists seeing a possibility of flourishing and actually making a living out of that. So there was a complete economic turn. If until 1990s, being an artist was a question of survival, from the 2000 on becomes an option of, wow, maybe I should go to an art school. Maybe that can be, I can make a living out of that. Maybe that's a way to become someone that has a voice. Now, what happened and also from the 2000s to now is the reevaluation of the canon. So until, I would say, 1998, most of the shows were dedicated to artists that came from the lineage of the neo-concrete, from Lydia Clark to Elutica and Willie de Castro. Those were sort of the founding stones of the system. All of a sudden, you have this revision that starts looking at Native American possibilities that were coexisting and coalescing, but nevertheless put into some sort of exotic box until then, and then come into the system. And you also start looking at the marginals, the marginalized artists that were Afro-descendant. And remember, Brazil is a country that 90% of the population is of Afro-descendancy. And yet the canon has been for 50 years, since the post-war, 100, I would say almost 98 or 99% white. So for us, there was a very interesting thing starting the gallery, looking at those statistics and the demographics and saying, where are these artists? Where are they? I'm sure they exist. I'm sure they're there. I'm sure there's things to be said. So we came across artists like Paulo Nazareth, and we came across artists like Sonia Gomez, who have been doing this very silent work, but very important. And I think the role of the gallerist was and is to give voice to those authentic positions that are nullified by the canon. So for us, the term Latin America wasn't always necessary. It was almost an exception, a term that was put on us as a stigma.
Yeah.
Thank you. Donald?
For me, I think the term Latin American is a source of personal pride, and I think I approach it first and foremost that way. But it's also a very complicated term, right? As Luis Pedro Zoramas, who's in the audience, wrote in an essay at one point, he was pointing out that it's really a catch-all phrase for so many different cultures and so many different histories. But certainly at a time, it was in a moment of kind of strategic essentialism, it kind of made sense, so to speak. I guess in thinking about that question, what I think about is when it's applied to the couple of artists that we work with who are under that umbrella of Latin American art. And oftentimes, Lydia Clark, whose estate we represent, Lydia Clark gets referred to as the most radical, most important Latin American female artist of the 20th century, which is certainly true. But you could remove those qualifiers and still have a very true statement. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, I think.
Absolutely. Great. Patrick?
Okay, so I want to wear two hats. The hat of a collector. I've been collecting for almost over 35 years old. 35 years I've been collecting Latin American contemporary art all around. And also I've been in the world of institutions. And so I began getting aware of what was going on in Latin America in the mid-'80s. When I think for the first time, Latin America was beginning to have, as a consequence of globalization, was beginning to have international projection. So since then, I've seen a process, an evolution that has been quite interesting, where obviously the market that was, as Gabriel mentioned moments ago, the market that was what we were fighting against, even if it was a collector, became kind of accepted. The gallery system grew a lot mainly in the 90s and 2000s. And Latin American artists begin to circulate in all the elements that are part of the international ecosystem of art. So I think that the market has become extremely important for cultural production in all of our countries, even with the big differences that we have. But what I would like to focus more is the evolution that institutions have suffered over the years. When I began to circulate, not only in the US, in all the institutions that were opening up to Latin American production and to Latinx production, when I began to get aware of what was going on with museums, there were very few museums in Latin America that were presenting works besides the local cultural production. And that's when institutions like Mali in Lima, like the Pinacoteca in Sao Paulo, like the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City, and after the Tamayo Museum, these institutions really began playing a very important role in presenting what was going on internationally, but mainly the focus on Latin America became crucial. So I think it's interesting to see how this got completely mixed, the global and international with Latin America. But I would like to now mention the situation with what we call now Latinx, the situation with the production of all the artists that have Latin American roots but have already born or been active late in the last decades in the US. And I'm representing here el Museo del Barrio. This is an institution that was founded 50 years ago mainly by activists, by Puerto Rican activists. It was founded because Puerto Rican artists didn't have representation in big international museums in the US. And it was not only to bring visibility to what was going on with the Puerto Rican community, but also to bring visibility, that changed very quickly, to what was going on with all the Latinos in the country. So 50 years after, it's interesting. I've mentioned just one. The only Puerto Rican artist that is represented in the MoMA collection is Rafael Montañez Ortiz. And this is crazy because this is a city where the Puerto Rican community has been very active, culturally very active, since the early 20th century. And so I do think that in terms of what Latin America means all today internationally, it's interesting to see how difficult it is to be a Latinx artist. There are very few. We are organizing, the Museo is collaborating with Frieze Art Fair, and we're organizing a section where we put in discussion, in dialogue, Latinx and Latin American art. It's very easy to find Latin American artists with representation in galleries in the US or in galleries that do well internationally, but it's very difficult to find Latinx artists with galleries, with any kind of a gallery. So, now, as the executive director of El Museo del Barrio, I'm trying to discuss the complexity of the production of Latino roots in the US, but also the production of Latin American artists in different countries of Latin America, the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and South America. And I think it's important to discuss the complexity of the cultural roots of Latinx and Latin American artists.
Can I just add one thing about that, which is very interesting what you're saying, because I think that extrapolates also to a lot of the artists in the 90s that left Latin America. When the dictatorships were over at the end of the 80s in Argentina, in Chile, in Ecuador, Uruguay. You know, all of these artists had the possibility, or even like some of us, to leave our countries, to come abroad, to study and have our education. But a lot of those artists have been abroad for already 30 years, and they're completely unrooted. Yeah, and I think that is another problem, and I see it in my gallery, and I see it with the Latin American artists that have been living in Europe and the UK for 30 years without galleries. And this is something that for me has become quite crucial as a sort of ethical thing of thinking this sort of, it's a constructive problem, but it's a very real and meaningful one, where these artists are speaking this sort of international language, yet their production and their poetic and their artistic process has to do with their origins and their, you know, being unrooted. So I hear you, Patrick.
The lack of representation, for example, of an artist like Juan Downey,
Exactly.
in New York, who was so active and so vibrant in the 70s.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's interesting because this kind of phenomenon of diasporic art, which certainly in the curatorial field, the processes of recovery for Latin American art and Latinx art were sort of parallel and different. You know, one was very much a community-based sort of bottom-up, and the other was, to a certain extent, sort of a top-down. And I feel like they're sort of making their peace curatorially, little by little, but what we're seeing in the market is that that's not happening at all. That, as you say, this whole sort of discussion of Latin American art does not tend to include Latinx artists or necessarily artists who, you know, lived or have worked in complex and different situations.
But I will say that it seems to me a small trend that I've been seeing is that at least younger galleries, younger US galleries, are incorporating Latinx or Latino, Latina, if that's your preferred term, artists into their program. Not so for artists of a previous generation, but where I've seen a little bit more of a hiccup is those collectors who have really collected specifically in the category of Latin American art are still quite resistant to collecting artists who are US born and identify as Latinx.
Yeah.
And just to add something, I feel also that this question of collecting Latin America is also something that is very permeable and shifting now. I think the question of collecting American art and collecting Latin American art is a question of the past century. I think we're entering this realm that is absolutely inexorable, where everyone is somehow nomadic and everyone is somehow unrooted. And we are relating to our roots, but at the same time, we're speaking something that is the questions of our current times, which are pertinent to anyone living pretty much anywhere. So I think the getification is narrowing and it's becoming less interesting.
Because if I understand what you're saying is that the collectors you're selling to are themselves unwilling to be sort of categorized or take these labels on themselves.
Yeah,
I'm wondering, Donald or Cecilia, do you have that same experience? Like who would you, I know nobody has a typical buyer, but how many of your buyers would you say would identify as being specialized, and how many are modern and contemporary art buyers? Maybe Donald and then Cecilia?
We certainly have a fair number of clients that we've worked with, and there's one particular collector, Diane Hawley, and the late Bruce Hawley in Phoenix, Arizona, whose collection my gallery has advised well before I was there, and a number of other collectors that we work with who identify as such. But I feel that in a newer generation of collectors, or I feel like I'm best serving the estates of the Latin American artists that I work with when I'm presenting them in a context that is not specifically Latin American. I think the most significant sales that we've made recently were of Ligia Clark and of Tunga to institutions where that work was going to be presented in a much broader sense. To SF MoMA with works by Ligia Clark, and recently the Tate with Tunga. And also with collectors. I'm always trying to bring that work to collectors who are not already familiar with that work specifically. Because those artists are already also represented by galleries that present a more specifically Latin American context. So from my point of view, I think that's what we can bring to the table.
Cecilia, how many of your clients come to you saying, you know, I want to collect Latin American art, or are already doing that?
I think for me the challenge goes the opposite way. For me the big challenge is getting a collector from, let's say, Chile to come and say, I want to build a collection of Latin American art. I find it's much easier for me to sell to Americans. Of course, they've got the infrastructure, they can make the relationships, or European collectors that want to, collect avant-garde from the 20s, 30s. That's an easier conversation. I think the challenge is for Latin Americans to be part of the game. To find, it's different Brazil, but the Southern Cone, sadly, we're not there yet. And that for me is sort of the biggest challenge, is incorporating, let's say, one of the artists, currently the Argentinian artist Victor Magariños in our show, which I had no trouble selling it to an international gang of collectors, but I had a lot of trouble placing those works in Latin America. And that, for me, continues to be the big challenge.
Why do you think that was?
They need to be more, they need to be in Lorraine Augustine, maybe. They still want to see it more marketed. So it's kind of like a maturity thing, I think, sadly.
One of the things that has, again, been so significant in the last decade or so is the entrance of these big institutions into the field. That the players include MoMA, Tate, Houston, several, Reina Sofia. So several of these very encyclopedic institutions, to some extent, have now actively been involved in Latin America. But as Donald mentioned, then museums, SF MoMA is not particularly recognized for doing that, but then sort of hears about it. So I wonder if we could maybe for our last sort of round talk about that relationship of institutions collecting and galleries. Like, what do you see the role of the gallery in that conversation from your experience? And maybe we'll start with you.
Okay, so sorry, the role of the gallery as placing works in institutions?
Yeah, in other words, what kind of conversations do you have with curators, with trustees, with board members? Like, what is that relationship with the institutions like, with the artists that you're promoting?
Yeah, so for me, it's always finding a new home for the work, and finding the perfect fit is almost like matching somebody to something. So I'm a very small operation, so for me, this is the best part of my job, is basically thinking, this magnificent piece has to dialogue with, my curatorial old head never leaves me of trying to match things and finding where that piece is so that it goes there and it sleeps in that house. And that's sort of what I do and what I love to do. So for me, the conversations are incredibly personal, incredibly specific and focused. So it's almost it's sort of almost like a science. It's sort of really boring. Yeah, and I only do 4 shows a year, so it's a lovely challenge, but it really has to do with finding the right home for that right piece.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, because before you mentioned how hard it was to engage collectors in South America with an artist like Victor Magariños, who's not known. There's no real bibliography. Feliciano Centurion, the show you have now, there's not really a bibliography. You Google it, not much shows up. What do you find when you're speaking to curators, like how is that conversation when you're introducing somebody who doesn't have a context, who's not literature club?
I have to bring all of my sort of intellectual ammunition to try to make that happen. And it's not easy, when there's no bibliography.
I have to say that I think galleries have played a very important role opening the canon for institutions. And very often we discover institutions where we have all your curators and people doing research about, for an institution like El Museo del Barrio, which is a cultural specific museum. And sometimes we get a lot of information that comes from galleries, and it has been crucial to open up the canon of museums.
I might do an add-on to there. It's, again, I think a relatively new phenomenon are artists who come from galleries straight into institutions without curatorial validation. I think of somebody like Carmen Herrera. It's been a very clear sort of boom. That I went from seeing in a gallery to the museum. I still don't see it in PhD dissertation. I don't see it on, that is, I think, a very new phenomenon that speaks to the times that we're in, that an artist can be discovered and placed. Whereas before I felt that needed to go through that intermediate stage of smaller museums, group shows, then a solo show in a university museum, and then eventually get to like a mainstream museum, and then the sort of coronation would come. But these processes are extremely accelerated now.
Because also the art market has changed a lot.
Right, exactly.
And there are much more galleries than ever. and there are, I think, really good and experimental galleries that are not only bringing a younger generation of artists, but also historical artists that were totally marginalized and forgotten. And I think that has helped a lot. It's a very important part of the ecosystem that we're discussing.
So Pedro, I know that your gallery has been, I think, remarkably successful in bringing artists like Pablo Nazaret or other artists to a kind of global awareness with institutions, with collections. So I wonder, how has that relationship been for you?
It seems that the question of galleries vis-a-vis the recount or the telling of art history is pretty much one of shedding light and shedding visibility to things and chapters that have been chosen to be ignored. So the role of the gallerist, I think, in pushing things, and I'm using this term intentionally, pushing things to museums, is very much one of trying to shed light into chapters or positions that have been vulnerable or weak or out of the mainstream. And I do believe, and I strongly do, that a gallery can really do the role of being this editor of history, or weaver of history, of bringing these fragments that are sort of scattered and putting them together. Similar to the role of a curator, the gallery, in a way, in its curation, is one of searching new ways to recontextualize. So I think when you see the SF MoMA, for instance, selling a Mark Rothko to buy Latin American art, they will have to really do their research and find out what are the important things that they're going to go about. And that's where we come to pretty much defend positions.
You see, that's so, I mean, you're a little bit younger than me, but that's what, curators used to do. I mean, that was sort of our job, was to shed light on the underseen. And I think that's where there's really been a shift. I think the dynamism and the nimbleness of the commercial world, allows you to take bigger risks, to, bring artists who sort of earlier in this phase. To me, that's been such a remarkable shift to watch, and it's been very, very quick. And I think a gallery like yours really exemplifies kind of that process. Donald, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, I think that it's still something that we can really help each other. Like, you're talking about the nimbleness of galleries to be able to show work quickly, but there's still a lot of collaboration, I think, between the work that we do and the work that curators such as yourself do. I mean, we're going to be doing the first show in the United States, as you mentioned, of Lucia Nogueira, and I learned about that work through your Sao Paulo biennial. Right. But I think that while many museum curators from the United States who saw that Sao Paulo biennial might want to have done that, it's going to be down the road in the pipeline. So we just, because of the flexibility of our program and the speed with which we're able to do things, we can do that in the next few months. But we're contributing to the same story, I guess. We're just able to use our resources differently.
Yeah, anyone who's worked in an institution, be able to do in less than a year, a major show of an artist like that is a miracle, because institutions have become, and I think increasingly complex as institutions. It's more and more expensive to do shows. Patrick, you must see this all the time. It's not like you can just make a decision and in 6 months have the exhibition there, which is something that galleries can kind of take that risk. You have a board to respond to, you have fundraising, you have many different constituencies to deal with.
I used to work that way in Mexico, where money was not a problem. But yes, it's fundraising, as well we know, it's pivotal for museums. We are every day doing fundraising and looking for support, not only to produce exhibitions, but to produce any kind of programming inside an institution. El Museo del Barrio it doesn't only play a very important role as a museum, programming exhibition, but also public programs and education is really, really important, because it's the way we connect with communities, with Latino communities in New York. But But really, I totally agree. The ecosystem is much more complex than before. We not only have collectors, not only galleries. We were talking a lot about galleries and museums, but also the way we often communicate through collectors, through board members and collectors, who are actively supporting galleries and often part of museum boards, are also, I think, an instrumental element of this connection.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like there's each of these topics we could go really deep and discuss in depth, but I do want to make sure we have a chance to open it to the audience and hear any questions for any of our panelists, or Dawn, whose name was mentioned in the presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you, all of you. It's a tremendously interesting, very stimulating conversation. Just two comments very quickly. One is that when I was, in respect to Gabriel's first question, when I was organizing the Art from Latin America exhibition at the Hayward, that Cecilia very kindly mentioned, I was very surprised, having been teaching Latin American art for 20 years, that the concept didn't really exist in Latin America. Mm-hmm. You know, each country thought of itself as, you know, that country, but that was not necessarily reflected in a wider sense of what it was. I don't know how far that's changed now. In a sense, the whole question has become so much more complicated, as you were saying, that you know, it's a different discussion. And the second thing is that I was trying to remember at that time, in the mid to late 80s, which galleries I went to borrow from. And there were very, very few. It was mostly institutions and private collectors. Whereas I think that the transformation now is very great, and one couldn't do an exhibition of that encyclopedic kind without coming to the galleries.
Thank you, Dawn. I might just add something to that as a fellow European. That question of the term Latin America not being used in Latin America, but being used, I think reflects this broader of how many of these paradigms were generated in the United States. So the idea of Latin America is a very productive, useful term for the United States to separate itself from the rest of the American continent. And again, it comes up with this term Latinx also. Like, why is Claudia Fontes not a Latinx artist? In a sense, it's the same process. But so many of these terminologies and these operating systems are developed from here, from the institutions or from the market here, and then kind of uncomfortably get exported back to Latin America. As Pedro was saying, where in Brazil, nobody would necessarily use that as a useful term. So, but thank you for that, Dawn.
I think just to add to that, one thing that I think is interesting, which we didn't touch upon yet, and with all due respect to my colleagues in the audience who work at auction houses, but I don't think that they're necessarily a model to follow, but I do think it is interesting that Sotheby's and Phillips, at least, have abolished their specific sales of Latin American art. I think Christie's, if I'm not mistaken, still holds dedicated sales. Yeah. But I wonder how that will change things over time, which artists will get naturally pushed out because they don't make sense in any of the other sales. And what the side effects and the repercussions will be to those changes on the side of the market.
I agree. Yeah, thank you. Yes? There's a microphone coming, if you wouldn't mind waiting.
Following the question of gentleman of Lauren Agustin about the auction houses, the Christine and Sot, in the 80s, when these auction houses started exhibiting Latin American art, I think the strong artists were Mexican modern. That was the hot thing. Tamayo, Calo, and Rivera.
Sure.
I wonder if now auction house like Sotheby now, they don't have really the outstanding artists or the customers or the collectors that are buying not only Mexican art, but other Latin American art that's really most valuable. I think that could be.
I unfortunately don't feel properly prepared to answer that question since I'm not, since I don't work at an auction house and I haven't really closely studied what's at the height of that market right now. But it seems to me that it's still a very robust market, and that those, whether they're still dedicated sales at Christie's or whether they're works by Latin American artists spread across different sales, that there's still quite an appetite for that kind of work. And I think that In the primary market, which we work in, there's still very much an interest in people collecting in those categories. I think that there's, in terms of artists that from that category that seem to be most sought after right now, I would say that a lot of Brazilian modernism seems to still make that kind of natural transition into modern and contemporary sales, whereas some of the Mexican work that you were mentioning was most popular when those dedicated sales started happening is maybe less interesting to a kind of broader collector base, which ties into what I had said, that there will be certain artists that don't really find a natural home in other dedicated, in other sales that, whether they're modern and contemporary or what have you.
I think what used to happen in the auction world, and it's interesting because in other fields, the auction world as the secondary market or even tertiary market, it sort of reflects the general taste and functioning of the rest of the system. So the artists who do well in museums and collections who've been validated, who have books. What happened in that period, I think, that you're talking about, the 80s and the 90s, is that it became its own marketplace. So people would fly from all over Latin America to New York, and there were artists who didn't necessarily have primary markets or even secondary markets. Like the New York auction house became a primary marketplace, and that was really unusual. And in terms of when you looked at other fields, if you looked at American art or European art or old masters or whatever it was. So there were artists I've only ever seen in the pages of the Christie's catalog. I have no idea who they are. I've never seen them anywhere else. And that's interesting. That shows how different this market was. And I think now we're in a process of mainstreaming where the galleries are starting to behave like galleries, the auction houses are starting to behave like auction houses, in a much more perhaps conventional way. Maybe we lose some of the local color, but I think it's a overall process of kind of adjustment. Do we have any other questions or comments? We have such a distinguished group of people. I'm looking around at many, but I'm not going to embarrass anyone by calling them out. But I'm very tempted because we have a lot of experience in the room from all parts of the market and collecting system. Yes, thank you, Annie. Microphone, sorry.
I'm just curious because one thing that none of you mentioned was the role of the art fair in the acceleration, the massive acceleration of knowledge of Latin American, Latinx artists. I'm wondering if you could speak a little to that.
Maybe I can ask, because you're actively collaborating with Frieze, or have collaborated, so...
But I think that the first international art fair that had an important representation of Latin American art and Latin American galleries ever was Arco, no?
Yeah.
I think Arco was, I was doing memory, and I think Miami became a big thing when finally there was an art fair place in a city that had a lot of Cubans and Puerto Ricans, and everything changed. But I totally agree. Not only the fact that Latin American galleries and Latin American artists began to have representation in international art fairs, but also that Latin America began to open art fairs. Sonamaco, and before Sonamaco we had Expo Arte, and then Brazil, Argentina, Arbo, and there was also an explosion of big and small art fairs in Latin America.
I wonder if any of the galleries can talk about your experience of those regional Latin American fairs.
Do you do them?
Do you do them? I overdo them, yes.
No.
Well, I think certainly the art fair has been crucial to create visibility and also to create this amalgamation between what is Latin American and what is not. In the very beginning, it seems that there were the sections, as you mentioned. Arco had a special section for Latin America that was very successful and sort of gave the scholars and museum curators the direct access to see what was being done down there. And I think as time went by, it's more mingled into the mainstream of the fairs. I think it's a marketplace, but it's also a place of reflection about what's being made. And art fairs concentrate and edit, not in a perfect way, as we know, and sometimes to see an artwork in an art fair is very challenging in its totality and in its quality, but it certainly has given the first access. It opens the door for the discovery of an artist.
And sorry, and I assume that for Latin American galleries, it was the only way to open up the market internationally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Donald, I mean, you must do countless fairs all over the world. What is your relationship to the fairs within Latin America? Do you go to them? Do you not?
Yeah, I try to go to them because, like I said, we've advised certain collectors of Latin American art, and that is a great way to see a lot of the material that's being made for the market. As Pedro said, it's a specific cross-section, but it is one that is helpful. And in terms of fairs that the gallery has participated in Latin America, we've done fairs in Brazil and in Mexico, but not elsewhere because we found that a lot of the other fairs in Latin America tend to be more regionally specific, and there's just not a place for us where it makes sense financially, to be honest, and just contextually might not make sense for us either.
Yeah, great. Maybe we have time for one last question, if anyone has. We're burning to. Yes, sir. Sorry, we had two questions. If you can, let's take them both. Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. One area of the market that gets neglected, I think, is the end game. Collectors enjoy the collecting. They're like children. Then what are you going to do with them? Like, we live in Argentina, and there's no place, the infrastructure, the safety, you don't have a place to dispose of it like you do. We're used to the U.S. There's infrastructure, there's the tax structure, there are other smaller institutions. It's just a problem for collectors. What are you going to do? The kids don't want it. It'd be a nightmare to send it to the auction house, your kids.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I think that is one of these really important questions for how museums' collections are formed. This tradition, and of course in the United States, as you say, it's a very elaborate machine that, with many incentives, that encourages the gifting of collections to museums. I think that now the museum landscape has changed in the last decade in Latin America. I think initiatives like MALVA, like HUMEX have established museums with a greater international ambition, with perhaps more professional staff. So I'd like to be optimistic and think that there is a process of increasing consolidation, and they've survived. I was in Malva last week, and that's been through crisis after crisis, and the museum works. It's there. It has a professional staff. The collections are well presented. There's an education program. So I think there's reasons to be. In Brazil, of course, not to mention the incredibly vibrant institutions there. So I'm hoping that we're on a good path. Thank you for your question. We had one last question, Madam.
Well, I think you need more donations in some of the museums, the smaller museums, because you get many visitors going there, many visitors, plus parents are taking their children more to galleries and museums. Mm-hmm. And that's a way of them getting known.
With smaller institutions?
Yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, we have a
totally
proponent over here. Great, well, unfortunately our time is up. I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their incredible experience and insight with us. Thank you to the audience also. Thank you to TEFAF for the invitation.
Thanks again. Just want to close it out to thank this wonderful audience for coming. We have a full house for this. It's yet another sign of how important this topic is. I think this is the third panel I've done on Latin American art or so. Leon knows because he's fourth. Yeah, so, he's my ally, comrade, and co-saboteur in creating these conversations about Latin American art. Which we hope will become more and more well represented in the fair. Just put in that little comment as well. Thanks. This is just great. Please come back. Another hand for our great panel.